On November 7th, 1948, at a diplomatic reception in Moscow, Polina Zhemchuzhina approached Golda Meir, the first representative of the State of Israel to the Soviet Union. They spoke in Yiddish. For an ordinary Soviet official, such an episode would have been noteworthy. The Zhemchuzhina was no ordinary official. Her husband, Vyacheslav Molotov, belonged to the highest ranks of the Soviet leadership. She herself had previously served as a People's Commissar and as a candidate member of the Communist Party's Central Committee. She was known to industrial leaders, party officials, diplomats, and cultural figures. And when someone needed to get through the closed doors of the Soviet system, Zhemchuzhina's name sometimes appeared as a possible route to the top. That brings us to the central question of this story. Not what position she officially held, but how high could she actually reach? And if her access extended almost to the very summit of the Kremlin, was there anyone who could protect her when the critical moment came?
If you are interested in stories where a person's fate is revealed through documents and real decisions, like the video and subscribe. What matters here is not Kremlin legend, but how power actually worked. Polina Zhemchuzhina was born Pel Karpovskaya in 1897 in Pologi, Yekaterinoslav Governorate, into the Jewish family of a tailor. She began working as a teenager and joined the Bolshevik Party in 1918. The name Polina Zhemchuzhina emerged during her underground revolutionary work. Pearl is connected with the meaning pearl, which in Russian is Zhemchuzhina. But for our story, the important moment is when her name began opening administrative doors. In the early 1930s, Zhemchuzhina became director of the Moscow perfume factory Novaya Zarya, then headed the Perfume Trust. In 1936, she was appointed head of a main administration within the People's Commissariat of the food industry, and the following year became a deputy People's Commissar. In January 1939, a separate People's Commissariat of the fishing industry of the Soviet Union was created. Zhemchuzhina was placed in charge of it. In March of the same year, she became a candidate member of the Communist Party's Central Committee. So by this point, defining her merely as Molotov's wife would be historically inaccurate. She had her own career within the Soviet nomenclatura, her own sphere of administration, and her own position within the party-state system. But this level of power was not unconditional. As early as 1939, the state security organs were gathering testimony against people in her circle. The Politburo declared accusations that she had participated in wrecking and espionage activities to be slanderous, but at the same time concluded that she had shown carelessness and indiscrimination in her personal interactions. Zhemchuzhina was removed from her position as People's Commissar and transferred to a lower-ranking post in light industry. In 1941, she was removed from the list of candidate members of the Central Committee. This is the first warning sign. Her access was enormous, but the system had already demonstrated once that a position could be taken away by a decision from above. The next level was Molotov. Polina had been his wife since 1921. During the 1930s and 1940s, Vyacheslav Molotov headed the Soviet government, then remained one of the closest members of Stalin's ruling circle, and from 1939 onward directed the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. For someone who wanted to get a request to Molotov, Zhemchuzhina could serve as an informal route. And we can see this in specific examples. Academician Lena Stern passed Zhemchuzhina a letter intended for Molotov. The issue concerned paperwork for a scientific delegation traveling to Australia. Authorization needed to be accelerated for Stern and two colleagues. The fact that such an appeal was made is more important than its eventual outcome. A scientist of academic standing understood that if an international travel issue needed to be pushed forward, a letter could be passed through Polina Semyonovna. Even more revealing is the story of Solomon Mikhoels, artistic director of the Moscow State Jewish Theatre and chairman of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Investigative materials from the case against the committee contain testimonies suggesting that, when facing difficulties, Mikhoils expected to approach Zhemchuzhina. These interrogation records have to be treated cautiously. Stalinist investigations relied on pressure, and accusatory formulations cannot simply be accepted as established fact. But the documents record something important about perceptions within the Jewish cultural world. Zhemchuzhina was seen as someone who had a route to the top. The documented history of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee provides another example. In November 1946, Mikhail Suslov proposed liquidating the committee as politically harmful. It was not immediately shut down. Materials from the case mention Molotov's intervention and Zhemchuzhina's patronage of Mikhoils. This does not mean that she single-handedly saved the committee.
But once again, the essential point is visible. Her name stood close to a channel capable of bringing an issue before the highest Soviet leadership. Now her access can be measured not by job titles, but by distance from the final decision. Factory, Trust, People's Commissariat, Central Committee, Molotov, Politburo, scientists and cultural figures trying to reach the government through her. It seems almost impossible to get any closer to the center of power. 2 seconds. But this is precisely where Zhemchuzhina's story becomes a Jewish story, not merely because of her origins. During the war, the Soviet state created the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to mobilize international support for the struggle against Nazi Germany. Mikhoils and Itzik Pfeffer traveled to the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Great Britain. Zhemchuzhina maintained contacts with people connected to the committee, visited the State Jewish Theatre, and knew Mikhoils and other members of the Jewish intelligentsia. On March 14, 1945, she attended a memorial service at the Moscow Choral Synagogue. Attending a synagogue was not itself a crime. But 3 years later, this episode was included in an official party document as evidence of her supposedly politically unacceptable connections. After the war, the context changed sharply. The state became increasingly suspicious of independent contacts between members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and Jewish organizations abroad. In January 1948, Mikhoils was secretly murdered in Minsk by Soviet state security officers, although his death was officially presented as a traffic accident. In November of that year, the Politburo ordered the dissolution of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Arrests soon followed. And between the murder of Mikhoils and the destruction of the committee came the episode involving Golda Meir. By the autumn of 1948, Israel already existed. The Soviet Union had recognized it, and Golda Meir arrived in Moscow as Israel's first diplomatic representative. At a reception marking the anniversary of the October Revolution, Zhemchuzhina spoke in Yiddish with Meir and members of the Israeli delegation. According to Meir's recollections, Polina asked about life on the kibbutzim and wished prosperity to Israel and to the Jewish people. To a modern observer, this might look like an ordinary conversation between two Jewish women speaking a familiar language. But in the atmosphere of late 1948, the closeness of Molotov's wife to people whom the security organs were already associating with Jewish nationalism was viewed very differently by Stalin's leadership. We've reached the halfway point of this story, and this is where your opinion becomes especially interesting. Was Zhemchuzhina an independent political figure, or is it impossible to separate her influence from Molotov's position? Write your thoughts in the comments and support the video with a like. Now we can test the most important part of our access test. She did not need to appeal to a people's commissar. She had been one herself. She had her own channel into the party leadership. Her route to Molotov was direct and personal. Mikhoils, Stern, and other members of the scientific and cultural elite knew her. At diplomatic reception, she spoke with foreign representatives. But did she possess the kind of access that could stop repression once it turned against her? On December 29, 1948, the Politburo considered a report from Party Control and Minister of State Security Viktor Abakumov.
The resolution claimed that Zhemchuzhina maintained ties with Jewish nationalists, attended Mikhail's funeral, discussed the circumstances of his death with actor Veniamin Zuskin, and had attended a religious ceremony at the Moscow synagogue. It is important to phrase this precisely. These episodes were listed in an official accusatory document. They do not prove that any conspiracy existed. Zhemchuzhina's later rehabilitation demonstrates that the state ultimately did not uphold the crime for which she had been repressed. At the Politburo meeting, the question of expelling Zhemchuzhina from the party was put to a vote. Molotov abstained. But the Stalinist system demanded more. On January 20th, 1949, Molotov sent Stalin a letter in which he admitted that his abstention had been a political mistake and accepted the Politburo's decision. This is one of the most powerful documents in Zhemchuzhina's story. A man who negotiated with the greatest powers in the world could not use his position to oppose a decision coming from the summit of his own political system. Before her arrest, the couple was forced to separate. And then came the moment toward which this entire test of access had been leading. In January 1949, Polina Zhemchuzhina was arrested. The woman through whom others had tried to send requests upward now found herself in a position where there was no open door above her. Her investigation was connected with the case against the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Arrested members of the committee were questioned about Zhemchuzhina, and confrontations were arranged. She denied the accusations. Eventually, her case was separated from the main JAC proceedings. On December 29, 1949, a special council of the Ministry of State Security sentenced her to 5 years of exile in the Kustanai region of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. The special council was an extrajudicial body. A punishment lasting years was imposed through the administrative machinery of state security, rather than through a normal open court proceeding. Her relatives also suffered as part of the same case. The story of influence was now moving in reverse. Connections that had once provided access were becoming material for prosecution. And the cause of her repression should not be reduced to a single conversation with Golda Meir. That was a conspicuous episode, but the pressure on Zhemchuzhina emerged from a much broader context. The destruction of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, the campaign against Jewish nationalism, suspicions surrounding her connections to Mikhail's, and the declining political position of Molotov himself. Historians debate the extent to which Zhemchuzhina's arrest was also intended as a blow against her husband. But her case clearly unfolded within the broader post-war campaign of repression against Jewish public and cultural life. In August 1952, 13 defendants in the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee case were executed. Zhemchuzhina remained in exile. But exile was not the end. In January 1953, she was taken into custody again and brought to Moscow. The country was entering another wave of anti-Semitic persecution, the so-called doctor's plot, in which a group of physicians, most of them Jewish, were publicly accused of conspiring against the Soviet leadership. Zhemchuzhina was again interrogated in connection with an alleged Zionist conspiracy. And now the question from the beginning of this video takes on its most concrete form. She could rise from industrial administration to a union-level People's Commissariat. She could pass a request to Molotov. She could stand beside a man who for years had been one of the most powerful officials in the country. She could know Mikhail's, Stern, and diplomats. But the final door stood above all of those connections. On March 5, 1953, Stalin died. Within days, Zhemchuzhina was released. Her case was terminated, she was rehabilitated, and reinstated in the party. She returned to Molotov, but she never again resumed a state career on anything approaching her former scale. That sequence of events gives us a better answer than any ranking ever could. Was Polina Zhemchuzhina the most influential Jewish woman in the Kremlin? A historian cannot honestly create such a ranking. Influence cannot be measured by a single position. That Zhemchuzhina possessed a rare combination of advantages: her own career in government, leadership of a union-level People's Commissariat, membership in the party nomenclatura, marriage to one of the most powerful members of the Politburo, contacts with the scientific and cultural elite, the ability to pass requests to people whom the overwhelming majority of Soviet citizens could never approach directly. And none of it protected her. The central paradox of her biography is not that an influential woman fell.
It is something deeper. The Stalinist system allowed a person to stand astonishingly close to the center of decision-making while giving that person no power over their own safety. Access to power did not mean power over power itself. Polina Zhemchuzhina could be a door for others. When she needed a door herself, the last one would not open. If this story changed the way you see the structure of the Soviet leadership and the fate of Jewish figures in the post-war Soviet Union, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it. And write in the comments, what matters more in Zhemchuzhina's story for understanding the era: the influence she genuinely possessed, or how quickly that influence proved powerless?